What's going on YouTube? This is James Koo Quick from Learn, Build, Teach, and I'm back today with another code review, and this one is from, and I apologize if I mispronounce your name, is Victor Awotibebe, and he sent me a message with a project that we'll look at in a second and said he basically feels like he's made a lot of progress but doesn't really know what it's like to make those next couple of steps and then go and land a job in development. So that's a good story. I think that's a pretty common story a lot of people on here can relate to. So what he sent me is this project on GitHub called Epic Mail. A little bit of feedback on this page. You've got a description really quick description of what it is. Web service that allows users to share information over the internet. That doesn't really give me a whole lot of detail. So a lot of time on these README pages, having things like for a bigger description of more detail, and then also having maybe a quick like GIF or some images of different features I think would help. So that's a quick feedback on that. And then what I've done is I've opened up this project inside of gitpod.io. And this is, Gitpod allows me to basically check out other people's code and kind of set it up in a work environment for me to ideally run their application. And one of the pieces of feedback I have is you've got instructions here on how to use it, how to run it, which is good. They didn't work for me, and I don't actually know why. So it may be worth just kind of like testing this out in a different environment to see if this works for someone who's starting fresh, to see if there's anything you missed in these instructions. Other than that, what we'll do is we'll just dive into the code and take a look at what you have and then make some suggestions along the way. So for people that are a little bit new to this, typically what you want to do when you start to look at a new JavaScript application is look at the package.json file. The package.json file will have information about the name, version, description, those kind of things. It will have scripts defined, scripts that you can do, that you can call or use to run your application, to build it, to clean it, to do tests, all that kind of stuff. And then the last piece that's most important here is dependencies. So these are different JavaScript packages that this application depends on to be able to do its thing. And you'll see a lot of times in common frameworks, you're going to use a lot of NPM packages, JavaScript packages, to help make your development process a little bit easier. So there's a lot of configuration files in here, and this is kind of not a bad thing at all. This is a good thing. Obviously, you're using a lot of different tools, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a second. So I would say, just like briefly looking at this project, it's fairly sophisticated in terms of a beginner developer. So I think that's super cool. So let's go into, you've got a server folder here. Inside of your server folder, you've got a couple of different files, several different directories. And one of the things I want to applaud you on is going ahead and breaking your code out into separate folders. This is a great learning experience for beginner developers, is you need a way to organize your code. This almost closely follows the MVC pattern, the model view controller. A little bit different, but kind of similar, to where you've broken up your controllers are defined in a controllers directory. Then you've got under where your models, under SQL database, I think you've got a models file here. So that's kind of like your model in MVC. And then your view is actually your UI, which is a little bit different. So we'll talk about that in a second. So inside of your controllers, I'm just going to open one of these. I'm looking at, you've got a bunch of SQL statements here. So I'm assuming you're connecting to a SQL database. I forget where I found it in here. You're using Postgres. One thing, I've never used Postgres, so take this with a grain of salt. I would expect Postgres to have some sort of JavaScript library to help make it a little bit easier to work with the database than it looks like with you having to write all of your queries. So when I do MongoDB databases, use a package called Mongoose, and it abstracts away the majority of having to write actual queries. So there might be a package that you can look into. Again, I don't know this for sure. That might make some of this stuff easier. Another thing is, typically in other languages, when you create like true constant variables, you can follow let's actually see, create group query. You can follow this naming convention. I don't think this is quite as common in JavaScript because const is used a little bit differently, I think, than it is in Java. But the same idea here, when you have a constant variable that is really just, it really, I don't know how to best describe it. It really just, it never changes, which is the idea with constant. But you're not going to do anything with this other than use it. Other variables you can update, but not like change the reference, if that makes sense. This might be a little bit too much. But in this case, I think a good way to kind of make it clear that this is just a SQL statement that you're just going to use and never change at all, you can do the all uppercase separated by underscores. This is not a requirement. It's not as common in Java, but it is something I think that helps me a little bit in following code for that kind of stuff. So you find a bunch of queries in here. Then you've got your group controller, and you're adding on all these different functions. One thing I think is cool is you're using async. So async await. This is a feature of ES8, I think, JavaScript, that has been in other languages for a while, like C#. And I really love it. It gives you the ability to call asynchronous code, but then handle it kind of synchronously. So if you've done any JavaScript callbacks or promises things in the past, those can get tricky, and a lot of new JavaScript developers kind of stumble on that. This is kind of a clean way to make sure you know this query is going to finish by the time I go to the next line of code, basically. Inside of here, you're using ES6 destructuring to whatever this thing returns. It will return an object that has a property called rows, and you're just going ahead and getting that property rows by default. So this is great use of modern JavaScript using async await, using destructuring, things like that. I'm not really going to be able to follow all of this, but just the idea of having this separated out into separate controller files is great. I really like that. Then you've also got kind of the route definition of that, and what your route definition will do is define what your routes are, and then very cleanly just define these pieces are called middleware. A lot of times they're used for authentication and stuff like that. And then lastly, the last function that you pass in here is the actual function that gets triggered when someone visits that URL, in this case /groups. So I think you've got this broken out really well. This is a relatively big project for this kind of video. So you've got it broken out really well, which is great. You've got your file structure set up really well. You're using some advanced JavaScript or advanced or modern just JavaScript features, which is great as well. And I want to get into, let's look at the database file here. You've got one database file for index. One thing that jumps out at me is you're checking to see what the environment is that you're running in. And then based on that, if it's test, you're getting a different URL out of your environment variables. Environment variables, for people who are new to that, are basically variables that you can pass into an application, and they might change depending on which environment you're running in. So sometimes you'll run in production or development or test, and they might need different credentials to a database, for example, which is exactly what you're doing here. I think you can probably simplify this. Oops, let's do just this. So instead of testing to see what level you're running in, just make sure that the file that, or whatever environment variables that get passed in, just make sure that the appropriate database URL is being passed in. So in test, what you could do is have something like this. You've got a .env file here. You could have a .env.test. I forget what actually the format is, but you can tell it to use that specific file, and you'll use that locally, and separate environment variables in production. You can use something like .env, and this way you don't have to choose which kind of environment you're working in to then choose which database URL you want to use. So again, right here you've got two different database URLs defined. I think you can get away with defining one if you handle it in the correct way. So that'll simplify just a little bit there on your database file. All right, and then it looks like you're promisifying some stuff in here. So I'm not exactly sure what this will do, but I think you're kind of converting the idea of a query to return a promise, which is kind of cool. One thing that I would recommend looking into, I think you're using Postgres for this. I can't remember where I found that. Using PostgreSQL with things like Mongo databases with Node, they have packages like Mongoose that help interact with your database and kind of take away some of the difficulty. And I think, let me look up Postgres node. I think there's a package node Postgres that you could potentially use to, it works with callbacks, promises, async, await, and all that kind of stuff by default. So you wouldn't have to promisify the thing yourself if that's what's going on there. And then this should simplify your actual connection to the database and working with the database. So it might be something you can look into on the database side. All right, so let's open up the UI folder. And the first thing I notice here is this is basically, you've got just all HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. It doesn't seem like you're using a framework of any sort. And I'll get into why that might be beneficial here in a minute. But I think this is kind of cool that you're building this just from scratch. I like that idea. So let's look at the index HTML here. There's a few things that you could be a little bit picky about. Things like consistent naming convention, and I had a page in here that I was looking at, but consistent naming convention for your classes and IDs. So typically, at least this is how I do it, I'll use this syntax here where it's dashes in between the different names for classes, and then IDs will be camel case. So that's how I do mine. And you're doing something similar, but in this case, you've got all lowercase. So I would call this like nav uppercase B. This is a little bit picky again, but it's going to make it a little bit easier to read later on. And then let's look at what other, let me look at the reset password file is one I was looking at. So same thing here, nav button, capital B. The sign in form here, this is going to get hard to read when you start having longer names for IDs. So make that camel case, make it a little bit more readable. So you can just kind of go through here. I think for the most part, you've done it really well. Just make sure that those fit consistently, the naming convention that you use. And it doesn't have to fit mine. It just has to be consistent, right? So I see in here, you've got a footer on this page. You've got the same footer in your index HTML. So this is something with just raw HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. It's a little harder to reuse code, HTML snippets. It's a little harder to do that. That's why front-end frameworks exist, is to help optimize that scenario. So I would recommend one for just your kind of building your knowledge, also for opening up more opportunities in terms of jobs. I would look into React. The three modern, most popular front-end frameworks are React, Angular, and Vue. React, I think, is the most popular. Angular is used a lot of times like big enterprise scenarios. Vue is getting a lot of interest, but not really there in terms of like job opportunities. React, I think, would be the most practical and relevant for you to learn here. That way, it would help you simplify a lot of this code reuse. You could kind of dynamically update things on your screen instead of having to make a request to a form on the back end and then changing pages every time. So anyway, I think that's really something you could look into. And this would kind of cut back on the amount of stuff that you have in here. So I'll open up, this is a main CSS file. I would recommend, this is obviously pretty long, right? Scroll through this for a long time. I would recommend either breaking this out into more files, because you started to do that a little bit. Break this out into more files. Also kind of sections in here, you can kind of say this is page information, something like that. So there's page, then there's container information, just to give yourself a little bit of notes on what these things do, and then try to organize them either according to feature or specificity or alphabetical order. People do that as well. So I think there's a little bit of organization you can add to this to kind of help yourself out. Looks like you're using Flexbox, so you've got at least some modern experience with Flexbox and CSS, which is great. Don't know if you've heard of CSS Grid. You could look into that as well. But I've used Flexbox for a lot of my stuff and haven't really spent a lot of time on my end looking at Grid. So just something you could kind of be aware of that's out there. So anyway, you've got a lot of stuff in here. Split this out. Something like React would help make it easier to split this stuff out as well. So that's the UI. I want to just kind of touch on, I'm not going to walk through and critique these tests, because I'm not the best testing person by any means. But I think it's really great that you have tests included in here. This is something that I personally overlook with my projects, and I think most people do too. You really want to have automated tests for any sort of application that you build, so that at any given time you can have a good idea of whether or not the changes that you've made to the code work, right? And you have all these automated tests, it will automatically go through and just kind of validate that all the things work. So I think, one, that's great. You've got this also tied into Travis, which is a build server. So what I would assume here for people that are new to this is that once code gets pushed to GitHub, it gets checked in. This would probably kick off an automatic build in Travis, and Travis would then run the test to see if it passed, which is great. And you can kind of see this reflected in this part right here on the GitHub page. This is actually, I do some of this at work. I've never used Travis. We use Jenkins at work, so I'm new to tying this stuff into GitHub, but this is always super cool. This to me means you're taking this a little more seriously than most people and any of my projects, because I don't have this. But you're taking this seriously. You're investing in modern JavaScript. You're investing in testing. You're investing in Node, which I like personally, I think is super cool. Postgres, which is a modern SQL database that a lot of people are excited about. So I think you've got a lot of really positive stuff going on here. I think you've done a great job. This is a pretty big project, at least in terms of like this kind of video, and for me to just kind of dive in a few minutes. So I just want to say that there's a few things for you to work on, a few things that you can potentially look into learning, like React. Anyway, really cool project, just in the code. I would have liked to see it, but I couldn't get that to run. So maybe next time we can follow up with an actual running version. But I think you're on the right track. Keep working hard, and hopefully that job opportunity will come your way soon. That's going to wrap up this code review. I want to thank you guys for checking it out, and I will see you in the next one. Hey guys, if you enjoyed the video, hit that like button, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. You can also check out learnbuildteach.com to sign up for the newsletter to learn about my latest content. Thanks for watching.